My name is Sophie, and I am 32 years old. I work the overnight shift at a children's hospital in Portland, Maine, which means I spend most of my nights holding tiny hands and talking to scared parents in hushed hallways while the rest of the world sleeps. It is quiet, careful work. It suits me. I have always been the kind of person who moves gently through spaces, who notices the details others overlook, who thinks 3 steps ahead out of pure professional habit. That instinct, the one that makes me check a chart twice before administering anything, is the same instinct that saved me. Because when the most generous person I had ever known left me everything she had built over 60 years of living, my own brother looked me in the eye and told me it was his. He was wrong, and I had made sure of it before he ever opened his mouth. My Aunt Clara was not what most people picture when they hear the word aunt. She was not a soft, cookie-baking presence at holiday tables. She was sharp and deliberate and a little intimidating. With silver hair she kept cut close, and a way of looking at you that made you feel like she was reading the fine print of your soul. She had never married. She had built a small but thriving landscape architecture firm in Rockport over the course of 3 decades, and she had done it entirely on her own terms. She was the first person in our family who ever told me that being quiet was not the same as being weak. She said it to me when I was 14. And my brother Marcus had just taken credit in front of our parents for a school project I had done almost entirely myself. She had watched the whole thing from the kitchen doorway. She did not intervene. She just found me afterward, sitting on the back steps of our parents' house, and she sat down beside me and said, "You let him have that one, Sophie. But you remember what you're capable of, because he never will." I thought about that sentence a lot in the weeks after her death. The call came on a Thursday morning in October, just as I was getting home from a 12-hour shift. I had my scrubs still on and a cup of hospital coffee going cold in my hand when my phone rang with a number I didn't recognize. It was a man named Gerald Whitfield, an estate attorney in Rockport. He told me in a calm, measured voice that my Aunt Clara had passed away 2 days earlier, a heart attack in her sleep. He said she had been found by her neighbor, who had a key for emergencies. He said she had not suffered. I sat down on my kitchen floor without meaning to. My back hit the cabinet, and I just slid down and stayed there, the cold coffee tipping slightly in my hand, and I let the news settle into my body like weight. Clara had been 63. She had seemed invincible to me for as long as I could remember, and I think part of me had simply assumed she always would be. The grief that moved through me in that moment was not loud. It was enormous and quiet, like a door swinging open onto a very large empty room. Mr. Whitfield gave me a moment before continuing. He told me that I was named as the primary beneficiary in Clara's will. He said she had been specific and thorough in her instructions. He asked if I could come to his office on Monday to review the details. I agreed, barely processing the words. After I hung up, I sat on that kitchen floor for a long time, not thinking about money or property or anything, except the memory of her voice telling a 14-year-old girl that being quiet was not the same as being weak. When I told my brother Marcus, he called me back within 4 minutes. That told me everything I needed to know about the conversation ahead. Marcus was 38, 6 years older than me, and he had spent most of his adult life operating on the assumption that being the firstborn entitled him to the larger share of everything. He worked in commercial real estate in Boston, which meant he spent his days assigning value to things, and had come to apply that same framework to people. His wife, Dana, was cut from similar cloth, polished, transactional, and skilled at disguising naked self-interest as practical concern. Together, they were a unit I had learned to treat the way you treat a mild but persistent allergy, manageable as long as you stayed aware of it. "Clara left you the house?" he said. "Not I'm so sorry, Sophie." Not even a beat of silence for the woman who had just died. "Just that. She left me everything," I said. "Mr. Whitfield is reviewing it with me Monday." There was a pause. A specific kind of pause I recognized from childhood, the kind Marcus took when he was recalculating. "You know she had a lot tied up in that property," he said finally, his voice shifting into the smooth, reasonable register he used when he was about to suggest something that benefited only himself. "The Rockport market is strong right now. It wouldn't make sense to just sit on it. We should talk strategy before you meet with the lawyer." "We," not I. "We." "I'll call you after Monday," I said, and ended the call before he could redirect the conversation again. Monday came cold and clear. Gerald Whitfield's office was on the second floor of a brick building 2 blocks from the harbor, and it smelled like old paper and good coffee. He was a man in his early 60s with the kind of steady demeanor that I imagined had made him very good at sitting with people during the worst weeks of their lives. He shook my hand and offered me water before he said a single word about the estate. Clara had left me her house. It was a restored federal colonial on a half-acre lot in Rockport. 3 bedrooms, original hardwood throughout, a garden she had designed herself that looked out over a hillside dropping toward the ocean. The property had been appraised the prior year at just over $1.2 million. She had also left me her investment portfolio, her firm's outstanding receivables, and the contents of the house. My parents had each received a fixed sum, enough to be meaningful without being controlling. My brother Marcus was not mentioned in the will at all. I watched Gerald Whitfield's face carefully when he said that last part. There was no surprise in it, only a carefully neutral professionalism that suggested he had already anticipated this moment might be complicated. "She wanted you to have it without interference," he said, folding his hands on the desk. She was very clear about that. He paused in the way that people pause when they are choosing whether to say the next thing. Clara came to me approximately 8 months ago to update her estate plan. She mentioned that she had some concerns about family dynamics. She asked me to walk her through every protection available to ensure that her wishes would be honored completely. 8 months ago, she had known. She had been 63 and apparently healthy, but she had known the way certain people know, the way people who have spent a lifetime paying attention simply understand how stories tend to go. I asked him what she had suggested. He told me. And I listened to every word. The drive back to Portland took 2 hours, and I spent most of it thinking about my aunt. Not about the house or the money, but about her, specifically the way she laughed, which was sudden and full and slightly startling coming from someone so contained. The way she grew lavender along the south wall of the garden, because she said it was the most honest plant there was. It told you exactly what it needed, and then it thrived, if you gave it. I thought about the summers I had spent in Rockport as a kid when my parents were working, how the house had felt like a different country, quieter and more purposeful, and how I had tried to absorb as much of Clara as I possibly could before they came to pick me up. By the time I reached Portland, I had made my decision. I called in for 3 days off work. I drove back to Rockport on Tuesday and spent the morning in Mr. Whitfield's office with a cup of coffee and a stack of paperwork that I read every word of before signing anything. We moved quickly and precisely, the way Clara would have wanted. By Thursday afternoon, the property had been transferred from Clara's estate into a newly formed LLC, Hartwell Property Holdings, of which I was the sole member and manager. The investment assets had been moved into a separate revocable trust. Everything was filed, recorded, and legally airtight. Mr. Whitfield had been thorough. Clara had chosen him well. I drove to the house after it was done. I let myself in with the key Mr. Whitfield had handed me. And I stood in the front hallway for a long time, just breathing the smell of it. That particular combination of old wood and dried herbs, and something faintly like the ocean, even though the ocean was a quarter-mile away. Her reading glasses were on the small table by the window. A half-written letter sat on her desk, the pen still lying diagonal across the page, as if she had just stepped out of the room for a moment. I sat in her chair and I cried quietly for about 20 minutes. And then I felt something settle in my chest, something steady and resolved, and I stopped. My brother called that evening. I let it go to voicemail. He called again the next morning. This time, I answered. He had done his research, which I had expected. He knew the property value, the neighborhood comparables, the current rental market in coastal Maine. He framed everything as concern. That's what he always did, wrapping self-interest in the language of practicality and care. "You're a nurse, Sophie. You're working overnight shifts. You can't manage a property like this from Portland. The upkeep alone on a house that age, the liability, the insurance." He said he and Dana had talked it over, and they were prepared to help me handle the transition, meaning list it. Split the proceeds in a way that reflected family contribution, meaning give him money for doing nothing, and move on cleanly. I told him I was keeping the house. He sighed the way he always sighed, that long exhale that was meant to communicate infinite patience with my irrationality. I let it pass. "You don't understand what you're sitting on," he said. "I understand exactly what I'm sitting on," I said. "Clara left it to me. I'm keeping it." He hung up without saying goodbye. 30 seconds later, Dana texted me, "Just so you know, Marcus is really hurt by how you're handling this. Clara would have wanted the family to come together." I put my phone face down on the counter and made tea. They arrived the following Saturday without calling first. I was in the garden when I heard the car in the driveway, Marcus's BMW, which he washed every Sunday with the focused devotion of someone who had mistaken a vehicle for a personality. He and Dana came around the side of the house looking practiced, the specific look of two people who have rehearsed an approach. Dana was carrying a casserole dish, which was a prop. I understood. Nobody brings a casserole unless they want something. I stood up from the lavender bed where I had been weeding and waited. Marcus looked around the property with an appraiser's eye. He couldn't help it. He had done it since we were children with anything that belonged to someone else. "You've been staying here?" he said. "I'm moving in," I said. Dana made a sympathetic sound. "Oh, Sophie, you've been through so much. Grief makes us want to hold on to things." She said it gently. The way you talk to someone who has confused a symptom for a solution, it's completely natural. But sitting in this house alone isn't going to bring Clara back. "I know that," I said. Marcus cut to the core of it quickly, because he had never been patient with preamble when there was a transaction to conduct. "I spoke to a real estate attorney," he said, "in Massachusetts. I explained the situation, that Clara was in poor health, that she had become increasingly isolated in her final years, that there were reasons to question whether she had the full picture when she updated her will. He thinks there's a strong argument that the estate plan doesn't reflect her true intentions, that family members were unduly excluded." I looked at him. His jaw was set, and his shoulders had that particular squareness they got when he had convinced himself he was being reasonable. He was not a monster, exactly. He was something more ordinary and more exhausting than a monster. He was a man who wanted something and had located a story that cast him as deserving it. "Clara was sharp until the day she died," I said. "You know that. The courts don't always see it that way," he said. And there it was, the quiet threat under the sympathetic concern. I felt something cold move through me that was not quite anger and not quite fear. It was closer to grief, actually. Grief that this was who he was. That the woman who had given me every important thing I had ever learned about surviving this family could not be in the ground 3 weeks before her own nephew was building a case against her memory. I said very little for the rest of their visit. I accepted the casserole. I made coffee. I let them walk through the house, while I watched Dana mentally rearranging the furniture and Marcus photographing the structural details with his phone. I answered their questions in short, non-committal sentences. When they left 2 hours later, Marcus said he would be in touch with his attorney's recommendation by the end of the week. "Okay," I said from the doorway. He turned back, a flicker of something uncertain crossing his face. He had expected more resistance. "That's it?" he said. "I'll wait to hear from you," I said. He studied me for a moment, looking for the trick. He found nothing on my face because I had nothing to hide. I was entirely calm. The way you are calm when you have already taken every necessary precaution, and there is nothing left to do but wait. They drove away, and I went back inside and sat at Clara's desk and called Mr. Whitfield. He was not surprised. He told me he had anticipated this possibility, which was why we had moved as quickly as we had. He explained, patiently and precisely, why Marcus's challenge would fail. The LLC now held the property. Clara's estate had already transferred the deed to me personally before the LLC filing, and that transfer had been made during a period in which no one, including Marcus, had raised any question about her capacity. The timeline was clean and documented. An undue influence claim required evidence of isolation, manipulation, or coercion, none of which existed. Clara had kept an active professional life until 8 months before her death. She had corresponded with clients, managed her firm's contracts, and maintained her usual sharp and independent presence. Mr. Whitfield had file after file of documentation supporting exactly that. Furthermore, the LLC structure meant that even if Marcus pursued litigation against my personal ownership, the property itself was shielded inside a legal entity that he had no standing to pierce. He would be suing me. He could not touch what I owned as a business. "There's one more thing," Mr. Whitfield said. Clara left a letter. "I've been holding it at my discretion, which means it's yours to use however you decide." She wrote it herself 8 months ago, in front of 2 witnesses, both of whom are prepared to testify to her complete cognitive clarity on that date. In it, she explains, in considerable detail, her reasons for excluding your brother from her estate. She names specific instances over the years in which he behaved in ways she found disqualifying. She was meticulous, as she was about everything. If this goes to litigation, that letter becomes evidence. I imagine it will be very uncomfortable for Marcus. I closed my eyes and felt that enormous, quiet grief again. She had thought of everything. She had protected me even from the things she hoped would never happen. I asked Mr. Whitfield if we could prepare a response to deliver when Marcus's attorney made formal contact. "Absolutely," he said. "Let them fire the first shot. Then we'll answer it properly." The formal letter arrived 11 days later, on a Tuesday, sent by a Massachusetts attorney named Callahan representing Marcus and Dana Thompson as interested parties in the estate of Clara Ruth Hartwell. It alleged that the decedent had been subject to undue influence and potentially diminished cognitive capacity in the final year of her life. It requested that the estate be reopened and redistributed according to what it called the decedent's apparent family intentions. It named me as a party. It used words like exploitation and isolation. I read it twice, very carefully, the way I read every medical chart. Then I called Mr. Whitfield and told him we were ready. We agreed that I would not call Marcus. I would not respond to Dana's increasingly urgent texts, which had shifted from sympathetic to pressuring, to something approaching accusatory over the prior 2 weeks. I would say nothing and do nothing until the appointed moment, and I would let them believe that the silence was defeat. I spent the next few days at the house, genuinely, getting things in order. I spoke with Clara's firm's remaining clients and arranged an orderly wind-down of the active contracts. I had her reading glasses cleaned and set them back where she had left them. I pulled every lavender plant that had been hit by frost and composted the material and turned the garden beds. I was not staging anything. I was simply living in the house that my aunt had left me, doing the things that needed to be done, in the quiet and careful way she had taught me. Marcus called on a Friday afternoon. He said he wanted to give me an opportunity to respond before things became formal. He said his attorney believed the case was strong. He said this wasn't about the money, that it was about what was right, about honoring Clara's real intentions. I had heard some version of this speech my entire life. Marcus had always believed that his desires and rightness were the same thing. He had never questioned the overlap. "Can you come to Rockport on Monday?" I asked. He paused. "Why?" "There are some things I'd like to discuss in person," I said. "Bring Dana, and if your attorney is available, you're welcome to include him." Another pause. He was recalculating again, looking for the angle. "Are you willing to talk about options?" he said carefully. What he meant was, "Are you willing to give me something?" "I want to resolve this," I said, which was true, just not in the way he was imagining. Monday arrived cool and overcast, the kind of October day in coastal Maine that looks like the landscape is conserving energy. Mr. Whitfield arrived at 11, an hour before Marcus and Dana were expected. He sat up at the dining room table with his portfolio open and his demeanor in that precise register of polite, immovable certainty that I had come to find deeply reassuring. He brought a colleague with him, a woman named Andrea Phelps, who turned out to be a specialist in elder law and estate litigation. She was younger than Mr. Whitfield, somewhere in her late 30s, with the efficient manner of someone who had spent considerable time in courtrooms and preferred them to stay hypothetical. She shook my hand and said, "Mr. Whitfield has told me a lot about your aunt. She sounds like she was remarkable." "She was," I said. We were ready at noon. I made coffee, set it out, and waited. Marcus and Dana arrived at 12:15. Marcus's attorney had sent his apologies, a scheduling conflict. He said he would join by phone if needed. So it was just the two of them, walking into the house with the air of people who considered themselves already to be reclaiming what was theirs. Dana looked around the living room with the practiced eye of someone mentally calculating staging costs. Marcus's expression was guarded but confident, the face of a man who had filed a legal letter and believed the other party was on the back foot. They stopped short when they saw Mr. Whitfield and Andrea at the table. "I thought this was going to be a family conversation," Marcus said. His tone had an edge in it, the edge of someone whose script had just been altered. "It is," I said. "These are my representatives. Please sit down." Dana touched Marcus's arm with the briefest flicker of unease. They sat. Mr. Whitfield did not waste time. He opened his portfolio and placed 3 documents on the table in a clean row, the way a dealer lays out cards. He identified each one calmly and without affect. The first was the original estate transfer deed, showing Clara's conveyance of the property to me, dated and notarized, with 2 witness signatures. The second was the LLC filing for Hartwell Property Holdings, showing the subsequent transfer of the property into the LLC, with me as sole member, recorded with the state. The third was a certified copy of Clara's letter. Marcus looked at the letter. Something shifted in his face, a quick involuntary tightening around the eyes. He recognized her handwriting. I could tell, even from across the table. Andrea Phelps spoke then, with the smooth precision of someone reading a brief she could recite from memory. She explained the legal concept of standing as it related to an LLC. She explained the timeline of the estate transfer. She explained that the undue influence claim required evidentiary standards that the documented record would not support, and that Clara's letter constituted contemporaneous written testimony from the decedent herself regarding her specific, deliberate intentions. She noted that the 2 witnesses to the letter were both prepared to testify, and that their depositions had already been taken and preserved. She then said, very calmly, that if Marcus pursued litigation, Clara's letter would become part of the public court record. Every specific instance Clara had documented, every behavior she had named, every reason she had written down in her own precise hand for why she had chosen to exclude her nephew from her estate, would be discoverable, quotable, and permanent. Marcus had gone pale. Dana was very still. "There is a second document you should be aware of," Mr. Whitfield added, producing a final page. He slid it across the table. "This is an agreement in which you acknowledge that the estate transfer was valid, that you have no legal claim to this property or any asset belonging to Hartwell Property Holdings or the Clara Hartwell Trust, and that you will withdraw the letter from Attorney Callahan immediately and unconditionally. In exchange, Sophie has agreed not to countersue for the legal fees she has incurred responding to this challenge, which are substantial, and not to pursue any claim related to the harassment and bad faith litigation this process has constituted." He let that sit in the air for a moment. "There is no negotiation here," Andrea added. "This is the resolution." Dana looked at Marcus. Something passed between them, a silent and rapid communication that married couples develop over years, and I watched Marcus absorb the full dimension of what was in front of him. He was in real estate. He knew exactly what a public legal record could do to a professional reputation. He knew what Clara's letter would sound like read aloud in a deposition. He had likely known his sister for 32 years and had perhaps always, on some level, understood that her quietness was not capitulation. He had just never had cause to confront it directly until now. His jaw worked for a moment without producing words. Dana put her hand over his on the table, and I noticed the hand was not comforting so much as cautioning. I watched my brother and felt something complicated move through me that was not triumph. It was more like the feeling at the end of a very long shift when the crisis has passed, and the patient is stable, and you can finally sit down, not happy exactly, but steady, relieved in a way that has weight to it, because you know what it cost to get there. Marcus picked up the pen. He signed without speaking. He slid the document to Dana, and she signed below his name without looking at me. Mr. Whitfield collected the papers, reviewed the signatures with his reading glasses, and placed them carefully in a separate folder. "My work here is complete," Andrea said, rising and extending her hand to me. Clara chose her attorney very wisely. She and Mr. Whitfield said their goodbyes and let themselves out. leaving me alone in the dining room with my brother and his wife. It was the first time I had been truly alone with Marcus since we were children, which perhaps sounds strange, given the years in between, but it was the most honest thing I could say about the distance that had always lived between us. He did not look at me when he stood up. He looked at the table, at the window, at some middle distance that contained nothing. Dana picked up her coat from the back of the chair, and I noticed that she did not look at me either. At the door, Marcus stopped. He stood with his back to me for a second, and I wondered if he was going to say something true, something from underneath the calculations, something that acknowledged what had just happened as something more than a transaction lost. I waited. He said nothing. He walked out. I stood in the doorway and watched them get into his car and drive down the long gravel drive through the bare October trees and out onto the road and away. I watched until the car was gone, and the road was empty, and there was nothing left to watch. And then I turned back inside and closed the door. The house was very quiet. The dining table still had the coffee cups on it, and Mr. Whitfield had left a small copy of the signed agreement for my records. I picked it up and set it on the desk, next to Clara's reading glasses and the half-written letter she would never finish. I thought about calling my parents and decided it could wait until morning, when I would have words that were calmer and more considered than the ones I had available right now. I went out to the garden in the fading afternoon light and stood in the middle of it, in the place where the lavender had been before the frost, and I looked out over the hillside running down toward the water. The sky was that particular gunmetal gray that the coast gets in late autumn, low and textured and somehow clean, like everything that was going to fall had already fallen, and the air had nothing left to hold. I had won. The house was mine, legally and completely, in a way that could not be undone or contested or eroded. My aunt's life's work was protected. Her intentions had been honored. The thing she had tried to build for me was intact. And it still hurt, in the specific way that family loss always hurts, which is different from other kinds of grief, because it asks you to mourn something that never was rather than something that had been. I had not lost a brother this week. I had simply finished understanding what kind of brother I had always had. Clara had known. She had known long before I was ready to know it. And she had spent the last 8 months of her life making sure that when I was finally ready, I would be standing on solid ground when I arrived there. I stayed in the garden until the light was nearly gone, and the cold had settled in completely, and the last of the day had drained from the sky over the water. Then I went back inside, turned on every light in the house, and began to make myself dinner in Clara's kitchen, with her pots and her knives, and the particular cast iron skillet she had used every Sunday morning for as long as I could remember. The first night alone in a house that is truly yours is unlike anything else. It is very quiet and very real, and it carries the particular gravity of things that have been earned. I sat at the table after I ate and looked out the dark window toward where I knew the hillside was, though I couldn't see it, and I thought about what Clara had said to me on the back steps when I was 14. You remember what you're capable of. I did. I finally did. And she had made sure of it.